The wind carried the smell of burnt grass and horse sweat across the valley of Red Mesa, like a warning no one wanted to hear. It was the second summer without rain, the ground cracked like a rattlesnake's scales, the herd of cattle reduced to hollow ribs and dull eyes. Evelyn Hart stood by a broken fence, her calloused hand clutching a strand of rusted wire, watching the last spring calf wheeze in the red dust. She was 27, a widow for 10 months, and the people in the town of Cedar Crossing had given her a name they never said aloud in church, the stubborn widow. Her 5-year-old boy Noah clutched half a broken wooden horse silent, as if he already knew that tears were too costly here, as the evening shadows stretched a plume of dust separated from the trail. A lone rider formed against the fractured sunlight. He stopped 10 paces from the gate unmoving until Evelyn placed her hand on the stock of the Winchester, leaning by the porch post. He tipped his hat back, revealing dark hair, a thin scar running down his temple, and eyes the color of storm clouds, steady but not piercing. His name was Caleb Ashby, his voice roughened by dust. He said his horse had thrown a shoe needed the forge in the barn, and he was willing to trade labor for a meal and a place to sleep. Evelyn didn't trust men who arrived with the sunset, but his hands gave her an answer before his mouth did. They were hands that knew rain's hammers, wood, and silence. Not the hands of a debtor on the run, nor the hands of a hired gun looking for trouble. She pointed toward the barn, said he'd find water at the pump beside the forge, and told him supper would be beans and cornbread. Caleb thanked her as though she had offered him a king's table. That night when the beans simmered in the pot, Noah tugged at his mother's sleeve and whispered if the stranger could fix toys. Caleb overheard, borrowed a small knife, and sat on the doorstep carefully mending the wooden horse with a nail pried from an old ladder. The lamplight threw his shadow long across the dirt floor. Evelyn, watching from the doorway, saw the way he looked at the child, not like a man filling silence, but like one remembering. He mentioned a nephew back in Missouri. Few men invented nephews to soften hearts, she thought. The night hadn't yet deepened when hoofbeats broke the quiet. 3 riders, their silhouettes heavy against the faint moonlight. Leading them was Cole Rucker Dalton's foreman, the man who once laughed when he saw Evelyn wearing trousers instead of skirts while feeding cattle. He didn't remove his hat. He said he wanted to talk. Evelyn didn't invite him in. Cole stood in the yard, boots dusted, though the laces shone new as if he had only stepped into dirt when it suited him. Cole spoke of water. Red Mesa's clear fork ran through her land before curving east. The bank wanted security, the town wanted an example, a widow wanted peace for her child. He named a price. Evelyn heard every word like a mosquito buzzing against her ear, irritating, insistent, impossible to ignore. She said simply, "The land isn't for sale." Cole's shrug was that of a man who already knew the answer. He left her with a smile that felt colder than the night breeze. As they turned their horses, Caleb stepped onto the porch, his hands still dusty with wood shavings. Cole tilted his head, eyes narrowing. "Ashby," he drawled. "Thought you were buried in Dodge." Caleb said nothing. His gray eyes didn't move, but the air thickened around him. Cole chuckled, tapped his spur against stone, and rode off, leaving behind the certainty that he would return. Supper was beans, cornbread, and silence, though it wasn't uneasy. Evelyn asked if Caleb had fixed the shoe. He said it would hold until morning. Then he pointed at the roof beam, warning it would give way to the next east wind. He noted the windmill's axle was jammed, likely with grit, and suggested she fix it before winter. Evelyn couldn't recall the last time someone spoke of the ranch with such measured concern. Thomas had spoken with different words, words of trains and faraway places before the day a snapped rope crushed all his promises. At dawn, Caleb worked like a man born to the land. He patched the roof, freed the windmill, and by noon its blades groaned back to life, turning like a child learning to speak again. Noah laughed, chasing the spinning shadow. Then he froze at the sound of hooves. This time it wasn't Cole, but a man in linen tie, loose a pale city hat. Peregrine, the banker's envoy. He asked for signatures instead of water. His words slid smooth, clipped from paper, mentioning debt's propriety and the welfare of women and children. He looked past Evelyn into the bare house, stopping at Caleb by the barn. His address shifted from madam to my dear. He hinted at moral standing and community welfare. Evelyn smiled thinly, eyes colder than stones in a trough. She said the payment was due in 3 weeks and nothing would be signed but a receipt. Peregrine faltered for half a breath, then folded his handkerchief, tipped his hat, and left a faint scent of cologne behind. Clouds gathered low and heavy by afternoon. Caleb studied the horizon and murmured it might rain or only thunder. In Red Mesa, thunder often lied. Evelyn remembered lightning striking near the barn last year, a fire flaring, then dying as though ashamed. She checked every latch, every hinge. The first wind carried the metallic tang of deep soil and the promise of storm. The storm struck like a hammer. Lightning split the sky, illuminating cottonwood skeletons. Before the rain came, fire appeared, a streak racing across the grass, climbing the old fence, licking at hay stacked too close. Someone had poured kerosene. Caleb was already there, hefting buckets, shouting in a voice that cut through the crackling. Evelyn shoved Noah beneath the table, ordered him to run to the Johanssons if flames reached the porch, then rushed into smoke with a wet blanket. The fire knew the house. It remembered the open slats, the weak joints. It ran quick where she thought safe and slowed where she didn't. Caleb hurled water like stones at a beast's throat. Cows bawled, horses screamed. Evelyn choked on smoke but kept pushing, shouldering open a stall gate. A horse bolted past, nearly knocking her flat. And then she heard it, a laugh low and sharp from beneath the porch shadows. Cole, his hat brim pulled low, one hand resting on a revolver, the other holding an empty kerosene can. Lightning flashed across his jaw, cut from stone. He didn't shoot. He didn't flee. He stood to watch the ruin. Evelyn raised the Winchester, but the smoke clawed her throat. Her arms trembled, the butt slipped. Cole shook his head, patient as a teacher with a reckless child. A metallic crash came from behind him. Caleb, wielding a crowbar, flung it like a lance. It struck the can, shattering it into the mud. Cole staggered, shocked. Caleb closed the distance, tore the gun from his grip, and shoved him back into the storm's darkness. Then the sky opened. Rain poured down in sheets, hissing on flames, turning fire into smoke. The barn half stood enough to shelter what lived. Evelyn collapsed on the wet ground blanket, falling from her shoulders. Caleb stood before her, hair-plastered, eyes steel, darkened by storm. He asked where Noah was. She said safe. He nodded, counted the livestock, then knelt across from her. His voice dropped like a stone in a deep well. They'll be back. Next time they won't bring empty cans. Evelyn, her breath ragged, whispered back lower than the rain, then we'll be waiting. And the well will be full? The rain did not last long enough to cleanse the land, only enough to soak the earth until it steamed. When dawn broke, the barn smoldered in patches, half a roof hanging like broken wings. Evelyn stood in the yard with Noah clinging to her skirt, staring at the blackened beams. Caleb emerged from the wreckage, hauling charred boards aside his shirt, ripped at the sleeve, his arm streaked with ash. He moved methodically like a man used to building again after destruction. 3 stalls are gone, he said flatly. But the frame still stands. We can salvage. Evelyn wanted to believe him, wanted to draw strength from the certainty in his tone. Yet she felt the weight of the bank's deadline pressing harder than the storm itself. The fire had not only eaten wood, it had devoured time. By mid-morning, she hitched her mare Bess and rode into Cedar Crossing with Noah in front of her. Caleb followed on his patch gelding. The town buzzed with whispers before they even reached the feed store. People parted on the street, some with pity, others with smirks, all curious to see if the stubborn widow would finally bow. Inside the store, Carl Meyer stacked sacks of grain with deliberate slowness. When Evelyn asked for feed, he tapped the counter with one finger. Your account's overdue, Mrs. Hart. Can't extend further. Before Evelyn could answer, Caleb set a handful of silver coins on the counter. This'll cover it. Carl eyed the coins and the man, then Evelyn. Taking charity from a drifter now. Evelyn's cheeks burned, but she kept her chin high. It's payment for work he's done, and I'll thank you not to question my affairs. Carl hesitated, then shoved the sack toward her, muttering about widows who forgot their place. Caleb gathered the feed without a word, though the tightening of his jaw was sharper than any reply. Outside, the street had gathered spectators. Among them stood Pastor Williams and Mrs. Henderson, the town's chief gossip. Henderson's eyes flicked from Evelyn to Caleb, her mouth already sharpening words into weapons. Mrs. Hart, she called loudly, a woman in mourning should think of her reputation before keeping company with men of uncertain past. Evelyn froze, the sting cutting deeper than she expected. Before she could respond, Caleb spoke, calm but edged with steel. My past is my own. I won't have it used to shame this woman. The crowd murmured. Some looked away, unwilling to meet Evelyn's gaze. Pastor Williams raised a hand for quiet. Decency must be preserved. The community cannot ignore impropriety. Evelyn's voice, low but steady, cut through the whispers. Decency is raising a child and keeping a home alive when the land and the men around me fail. If that offends your sense of propriety, perhaps it is your soul that needs tending, not mine. For a heartbeat, the street held its breath. Then Mrs. Henderson turned away in outrage, dragging the pastor with her. The crowd dispersed, buzzing like flies after a gunshot. That night back at the ranch, Evelyn scrubbed the floorboards in silence, while Noah played with his mended horse. Caleb sat sharpening a tool, his movements slow, thoughtful. Finally he said, "They'll keep coming at you, Dalton's men, and the bank the town. Alone they'd wear you down." "I've been alone long enough," she whispered, more to herself than to him. Caleb looked up, eyes catching the lamplight. "Then let me stand with you." Evelyn felt her breath catch. The words were not grand, not wrapped in promises, but they landed heavier than any sermon. She saw in his face not pity, but recognition, a man who knew ruin, who chose to stay anyway. Before she could answer, Noah clambered onto Caleb's knee, chattering about the storm and the fire. Caleb listened with patience, nodding as though every word was a map to follow. Evelyn watched them together, a strange ache in her chest, an ache that frightened her more than flames or bullets. It was the ache of hope. That night she dreamed not of charred barns or empty fields, but of rain, real rain, falling steady, filling the well to the brim. And in that dream, Caleb's hand was in hers, firm and unyielding. But dawn brought more than dreams. Tracks cut through the mud beyond the corral, fresh and deliberate. 3 horses. The prince circled the house, then vanished toward Dalton's spread. Caleb crouched, tracing them with his fingers. "They're watching," he muttered, "measuring how close they can come before you break." Evelyn gripped the rifle harder. "Then let them see we're not breaking." Caleb's eyes lifted to hers. "Not yet, but they'll push harder." And as the sun rose over Red Mesa, turning the wet earth to steam, Evelyn understood the storm had only just begun. The next days unspooled like wire drawn too thin. Caleb rebuilt the barn's ribs with whatever sound lumber he could salvage, bracing the weak joints with crossbars and stubbornness. Evelyn rode the fence lines at dawn and dusk, mending where fire had chewed, and wind had gnawed her fingers split and raw. By afternoon, the sun returned to its old cruelty, steaming yesterday's rain off the soil, until the whole valley smelled like a blacksmith shop after quenching. Noah trotted between them, solemn, with a child's fierce purpose, carrying nails in a tin and handing them up like offerings. Water, once a worry, sharpened into a threat. The windmill creaked back to life, but the well's pull came slower. The buckets splashed fainter each time. Evelyn counted under her breath when she lowered the rope, the seconds stretching like a bad dream. 12, the first morning. 15, the second. 17, the third. She said nothing, but Caleb's eyes flicked to the well mouth each time, as if listening to a heartbeat that was growing faint. On the 4th morning, they rode to the Clear Fork to test how much flow remained under the bank's dispute. The creek ran shallow but steady, its whispering over stone more generous than the well's grudging cough. Willows leaned in with green that looked almost arrogant. Caleb dismounted and studied the far bank. Stakes had been driven in along a curious line, red flags flapping like small tongues. Evelyn's jaw tightened. Survey markers. Not the government stones, but new ones, hasty and bright, planted by hands that wanted to unplant a life. Caleb knelt and pressed his palm to the damp sand. "They're laying a paper river over the real one," he said softly. "When the judge looks, he'll see flags, not water." "Then we make him see both," Evelyn answered, though she could feel the bank's deadline ticking in her ribs. "We bring witnesses, men who remember the old stones, women who drew water here when their babies had fevers. We make the town remember what the truth looks like." They turned for home and found the truth riding out to meet them. 3 men waited on the ridge above the trail, backlit by the merciless sun hats. Low rifles slung too casual to be innocent. The middle one raised a hand like a greeting. It was Cole. Of course it was. "Morning, Mrs. Hart," he called. "Ashby," he savored the name. "Heard the weather's been rough out your way." "We may do," Evelyn said, keeping her horse paced slow and steady. Caleb reined a half-step behind her, the angle that let him cover her without spooking their mounts. "Shame about the hay," Cole went on. "Kerosene is a terrible ally. Slips right out of your grip if you're not careful." "Careful is not a word I'd hang on you," Caleb said, voice mild as dust. Cole grinned, but it didn't reach his eyes. Always did have a mouth on you, Ashby. I've got instructions today. Simple ones. Mrs. Hart is to ride into town and sign over her water rights for a fair price. Or we make a different kind of signature out here. The rifles tilted not much, but enough to turn air into ice. Evelyn felt her mare's muscles bunch the little shiver along the withers that said the horse had measured every man on that ridge and found them want of mercy. You'll have to shoot me off this saddle, Evelyn said, and do it with my boy watching from our porch when I don't come home. For the first time, Cole's smile cracked. Perhaps he had expected tears, perhaps a bargain. Instead, he found a woman made of fence post wood and storm glass. Caleb shifted his reins to one hand and let the other rest by his thigh. Not on his gun, not yet. Or he said you could get off that ridge and count to 1,000 and try remembering a time your life wasn't tied to a richer man's leash. One of the flankers laughed too loud. The sound spooked a bird, a quail bursting from sage. That sudden flutter broke the spell. Evelyn squeezed with her knees, and the mare stepped sideways behind a basalt outcrop. The move was small practiced, and it changed the angle so that the rifles would have to swing farther to find her again. Caleb flowed with her, his gelding answering like a thought. Dust rose. Heat pressed. For a breath, everything paused on a knife edge, where the next word would choose whether men bled. Then a fourth voice drifted up the trail, thin and precise. The voice of a man who had never learned to be afraid enough. "Gentlemen," said Peregrine, trotting into view on a glossy bay, "let us not lose our heads. There's a courthouse for this." Cole cut his eyes at the banker's envoy. "There's also a ditch behind that courthouse, and a gallows behind the jail." Peregrine returned smile neat as a ledger. "Mr. Dalton prefers the appearance of virtue. It serves him cheaper than the practice of it." A long breath shuddered through the morning. At last Cole spat, flicked his fingers, and his men eased their rifles. "Enjoy your paperwork," he told Evelyn. "We'll enjoy the river while you argue about the map." He backed his horse, and the three slid off the ridge like oil leaving water. Evelyn exhaled slow and long. Peregrine tipped his hat. "Prudent to live long enough to fight on paper," he said. "My employer appreciates prudence." "Tell your employer," Evelyn replied, "that when the paper loses, I still keep the water." That, Peregrine murmured, is why he is arranging for the paper to win. He turned his bay and rode away, as if he'd merely delivered a dinner invitation. They made it home without further incident, though the land seemed to watch them as they went eyes in every rock and spiky yucca. At the gate, Caleb dismounted and loosened the cinch, giving the horse's belly a moment to breathe. "They'll press you in court," he said. "They'll paint me dark and you darker." "Let them," Evelyn said. "But we won't go in blind." She looked toward the Johanssons' place, a mile of shimmering air away. "We'll bring Henrik. He remembers the army stones. Mary Patterson, too. And Doc Hartley. He keeps a book for everything. He'll have notes from that summer the surveyors camped by the ford." Caleb nodded, but the crease between his brows stayed. "We'll also need to keep watch." The fire was a test. Next time they'll come for the herd. You can't pay a bank with charred boards, but you can't live on paper law without cattle either. So they set watches. Evenings on the porch with coffee, gone thin lantern, trimmed low rifles resting where hands could find them in the dark. Caleb walked the fence line at midnight boots, whispering in dry grass, stopping beneath the windmill to listen to its new even rhythm. Evelyn took the 2 o'clock hours staring until stars blurred and thoughts played tricks. Twice she heard coyotes. Once she saw a pair of eyes beyond the fence, too high to be a dog. The eyes blinked and were gone. On the third night, Noah woke gagging from smoke that wasn't there. Evelyn carried him to the doorway, let the cool air clear his lungs while she hummed the song Thomas had used to steady skittish colts. When Noah's breathing eased, he tucked his head under her chin and whispered, "Mama, if we go to town, will they take me away because we don't say yes to them?" "No one's taking you," she said, and made the words a vow instead of a wish. The town did not make it easy to keep. In the days that followed, the church pews scraped as people shifted away when she sat. At the pump behind the mercantile, conversation dropped when she approached. A barrel of nails grew more expensive between morning and afternoon. The sheriff, to his credit, tipped his hat and said if she had a complaint, she should bring it properly. Evelyn considered telling him about kerosene and laughter, but laughter did not leave fingerprints. Henrik Johansson came with a sack of potatoes and his weathered ledger. He sat at her table and turned to a page that smelled faintly of lamp oil in winter. Stones, he said, tapping a line of neat script, 3 feet high, 5 of them between the ford and the bend. I put them with my own hands beside the survey men. They used a chain and a compass that sang when it passed metal, so they said. Doc Hartley followed his spectacles sliding down his nose as he flipped through his own record book. August of the government year, he said. Heat like a furnace, locusts in the cottonwoods. Lieutenant Morrison and a surveyor named McKnight. I wrote down the names because the lieutenant mispronounced my wife's first one, and she swore I should spell his forever wrong in revenge. Mary Patterson brought jars of preserved peaches and a memory of a flood year when the creek had jumped its banks. We tied ropes to the posts and held on, she said, and the water still dragged us and the stones held. I remember that because I thank God for every one of them. Each voice was a nail driven into a plank that led across a river of lies. Caleb said little, listening, the way men listen, in the last quiet minutes before dawn, when they know something will happen as soon as the sun lifts its edge. The evening before the hearing, Peregrine returned with papers tied in blue ribbon. These are copies of filings you will have to answer, he said, laying them on the table as though setting down a fresh loaf. There are also affidavits regarding the moral atmosphere of your home. A court is a house with many doors. Mr. Dalton likes to open several at once. Evelyn signed where she must and refused what she could. When Peregrine had gone, she stood at the porch rail and watched heat shimmer above the earth until the horizon wavered like a held breath. I'm not afraid of a bench and a gavel, she said. I know, Caleb answered. I'm afraid of the space between you and that bench. The hallway where men decide what they'll dare. He slept in the barn that night, despite the half roof and the scorched smell that clung to everything. Evelyn lay awake listening to the windmill's steady turning, to Noah's small breast, to the faraway cry of a night bird. When sleep finally came, it brought her a picture of the courthouse steps, red brick and bright sun, and a shadow that fell longer than it should, as if a man stood where there was no man yet. Dawn came hard and early. Evelyn pulled on her oldest boots, the ones that did not slip, and buttoned the dark dress that told the town she knew grief, but not surrender. Caleb saddled the horses and checked each cinch twice. Henrik and Mary arrived with their ledgers and their truth. Noah, solemn in a clean shirt, carried his mended horse in the crook of his arm like a talisman. As they rode toward Cedar Crossing, the land lay flat and glittering around them, every rock bright, every lie polished, every hope sharp enough to cut. The courthouse roof lifted above town like a stern brow. The clock on its face did not care about wells or widows. It cared about hands pointing where they were told. Evelyn squared her shoulders. If time would not bend, she would meet it head on. At the edge of town, a rider sat his horse and watched them pass. He did not move, did not speak, but Evelyn felt his gaze like a brand heating. Caleb tilted his hat brim lower, and the 4 of them rode on into the mouth of whatever waited. The courthouse smelled of ink and damp wool, a place built to echo footsteps and turn whispers into thunder. Evelyn walked in first, her hand tight around Noah's smaller one. Caleb followed close, carrying nothing but the steadiness in his stride. Henrik and Mary came behind with their papers and memories, the living scaffolding of truth. Heads turned as they entered. Some faces softened, but more tightened, folding into lines of judgment. At the front sat Judge Carlton, a heavy man whose jowls quivered when he cleared his throat. Beside him stood Elijah Morse, slick as grease and George Dalton broad and composed, dressed like prosperity itself. Cole leaned in the corner with arms crossed, his grin a slow knife meant for Caleb. The gavel cracked. This court recognizes the case of Dalton versus Hart regarding property boundaries and rightful claim. Dalton's lawyer, a city-bred man named Crawford, spoke first. His voice flowed with practiced confidence, presenting maps inked with fresh red line surveyor's notes, too clean to be trusted affidavits, hinting at improper conduct in the widow's home. Each word laid another brick in a wall meant to close around Evelyn. Henrik was called, his hands rough on the Bible as he swore his oath. His testimony was plain stone set by government men, measured fair boundaries that never shifted except in Dalton's imagination. Crawford pressed, sneered about failing memory about an old immigrant too fond of his own tales. Henrik answered with the page from his ledger, his neat script standing taller than any sneer. Mary followed, her voice trembling at first but strengthening as she spoke of the flood, that year of ropes tied to those same stones of thanking heaven for their solid weight. Crawford tried to interrupt, but her eyes cut him down, the eyes of a woman who had lost children to fever and still carried on. Then Doc Hartley brought out his record book, yellowed pages crinkling under the judge's gaze. Names, dates, weather. Lieutenant Morrison, Surveyor McKnight. The courtroom rustled like dry grass when he read aloud. Crawford objected, claimed hearsay, but the judge waved him down with a weary hand. Still the tide turned when Hicks Dalton, surveyor, took the stand. He recited his measurements, smooth as memorized hymns. He produced a map-stamped official. When asked if he'd placed every marker himself, his eyes flickered once to Dalton. Some estimates were necessary, he admitted. Crawford leapt to spin it, but the murmur through the room grew heavy with doubt. Then Pastor Williams rose, surprising all. His voice shook, but did not falter as he told of overhearing Carver and another man laugh about digging up stones near the creek. Cole cursed, half rising, but the sheriff's hand found his shoulder and pressed him back. The judge leaned forward, his spectacles glinting. This is serious testimony. Mr. Carver, do you deny it? Cole's silence stretched too long. Caleb's hand drifted toward his belt, though his pistol never cleared leather. The room held its breath. Finally, the judge pounded his gavel. Enough. I will not have this court turned into a saloon brawl. The evidence is conflicting. Until fraud can be proven or disproven, the property remains in Mrs. Hart's possession. Payment, if she has it, will be accepted. The pouch of coins and bills came from Evelyn's coat. She set it on the desk like laying down her own heartbeat. Every cent accounted for, scraped from neighbors, from Caleb's labor, from sacrifices too raw to name. The judge counted, nodded, and wrote his mark. The debt is cleared. A wave of sound rolled through the room. Some clapped, others muttered. Dalton rose red, spreading up his neck, his lawyers at his side. This isn't finished, he hissed loud enough for all to hear. Paper can bend, rivers can dry. I'll have that land. Not while I breathe, Evelyn said, her voice carrying clean to the rafters. Cole shoved past Caleb on his way out, shoulder striking hard. Caleb did not move, did not flinch, only whispered, touch her again, and you won't leave walking. Outside, the sun blazed sharp against the brick, the air suddenly free of the courthouse's weight. Noah clutched Caleb's hand, eyes bright. We keep the ranch, Mama. Yes, Evelyn said, though her chest trembled, with the truth that it was only one battle won. We keep it. The townsfolk spilled out behind them, some nodding now, where before there had been whispers. But Evelyn felt the other eyes too, watching from shadows, tallying debts not written in ledgers. As they mounted to ride home, Caleb leaned close. Dalton's pride took a wound today. Carver's will want blood. They'll not let this rest. Evelyn looked across the rooftops of Cedar Crossing, smoke rising from chimneys, children chasing a hoop down the street, and she felt the weight of both victory and threat pressing the same against her ribs. Then we'll be ready, she said. But even as she spoke, she saw Cole's grin in memory, and it followed them all the long ride back across Red Mesa. The ride home felt shorter than the morning ride in, but heavier. The courthouse's echo still clung to them, the sound of the gavel lodged like a splinter under skin. At the gate, the windmill turned with a calm, even click, as if reminding them that some things obeyed honest work more than men's schemes. Henrik and Mary saw Noah safely inside, promising stew later and watchful eyes tonight. Caleb walked the perimeter without being asked, checking posts, testing wire, reading the ground like a book. That evening, neighbors arrived in twos and threes with quiet hands. Mary's boys brought a coil of barbed wire and a box of cartridges. The Johansons left a lantern and a bundle of oiled cloth. Old Mrs. Vaughn, with the torn shawl, set a loaf on the table and muttered a prayer for stubborn people. Evelyn thanked each, her chest warmed and pained by the sight of such small generosities piled high enough to be called a wall. Caleb unrolled a rough map on the kitchen table and flattened it with 2 chipped mugs. They'll try one of 3 things, he said, drawing with a dull pencil. Rustle cattle, burn what the storm spared, or break will in the dark. We can't guard everywhere, but we can make it costly. He marked the rocky draw where sound carried oddly. He circled the cottonwood that dropped dead limbs without warning, and the narrow pinch in the fence line where a horse had to turn its head to pass. Evelyn watched his hand move. You've done this before, she said. More than I like, he answered. And I've seen men quit when it got too hard to be mean. Cole isn't that kind, she said. And Dalton pays the kind that don't quit. Caleb's gaze flicked up. Then we make him pay them twice. They set the watches they had talked about and added more. A bell hung from the middle fence line with a tripwire. Buckets waited beneath eaves, already full. A wet tarp lay folded beside each doorway. Caleb moved through the dusk like a man laying breadcrumbs through a dark forest. He showed Evelyn the angles that made a house harder to take and a yard more honest to defend. He spoke low, each instruction tucked into her hands like a tool. She absorbed it all, not because she liked the work of war, but because she would not let a stranger be the only one who knew how to keep her boy alive. After Noah slept, after the lanterns were turned down to thimbles of flame, they sat on the porch with the night pressing close. The cicadas droned. A coyote yipped far off, then another answered. Caleb set his rifle across his knees and squeezed his bad shoulder once, an old ache making itself known. Evelyn noticed and stood moving behind him without a word. Her fingers pressed into the muscle where scar met sinew. He hissed between his teeth, then exhaled as the knot gave. For a moment the porch was just the scent of juniper and soap and wood smoke, the kind of quiet that makes a heart feel like a cup being filled. "You don't have to do this," she said softly. "I know," he said softer. "That's why I'm here." The first sign came at midnight, not as hoofbeats or flame, but as silence. The wind dropped. The cicadas stopped. Even the windmill hesitated, one blade catching a breath and holding it. Caleb felt the shift in his bones and rose before he knew why. He moved to the yard's edge and held out a hand without turning. Evelyn put the rifle in it. Shadows bled from the cottonwoods beyond the far paddock, long and low, like wolves given men shapes. 4, then 6, then 8. Not a raid, a test. They fanned in a crescent, keeping distance from the bell line and close to the places Caleb had circled on his map. He almost smiled. Someone had been watching him watch. A match scraped and died too quick, a bad habit for a night job. Caleb used the sound like a measuring stick and picked his place. "Wait for my second shot," he whispered. "First one is to turn their faces. Second is to turn their hearts." "I can handle the third," Evelyn murmured. "That's the one that sends them home." The first shot split night in two. It hit nothing but a post-splintering wood with a clean crack that slapped the line of men like a glove. Heads snapped, bodies turned. The second shot came a heartbeat later and took the hat off the lead rider, sending it spinning into dust. The man's horse danced, half from fear, half from insult. A third shot answered Evelyn's and found the tin can they'd hung by the far fence post. It leapt and sang and fell. The sound tunneled through the dark, a metallic scream. The line wavered. One man, young by his outline, swore too loud. Another laughed as if to prove he didn't mind. But the hatless leader pushed forward stubbornly, trying to call the bluff that wasn't a bluff. He leaned, aiming low where men like Caleb might be. A fourth shot clipped his stirrup. Leather snapped. His boot stuck. He went down with a yelp he tried to swallow and failed. His horse bolted away from him, as horses will when a man makes himself small on the ground. Then the bell tripped, not at the paddock, behind the house. Caleb was already moving. The world tightened to a corridor, the kind where training saves what thinking cannot. He slid along the shadow of the porch, cut the corner, and nearly ran into the man who had crept to the kitchen door. They met at elbow distance. The intruder's eyes went wide, a pale gleam. He swung first, a blackjack arcing down. Caleb took it on the forearm and drove forward, a simple, ugly motion that doubles a man's knees. The intruder folded breath, leaving him in a hard grunt. His knife clattered and skipped into the weeds. Two more, Evelyn called from the front, her voice steady despite the pound of feet scattering. One limping, one cursing God in a borrowed accent. "I've got the door," Caleb answered. He knelt, tied the intruder's wrist with baling twine, and hauled him against the wall out of sight of the yard. "You picked the wrong kitchen." "We were just looking to talk," the man wheezed. "Then you should have brought a mouth instead of a blackjack." They held through the dark until the gray seam of dawn stitched the eastern sky. The men beyond the paddock had melted back into the cottonwoods. Their test failed, their pride bleeding in small private ways. The one at the door shivered with rage and cold. Caleb gave him water anyway. He took it like a man swallowing poison. Henrik arrived before sunrise with his old rifle and a soft curse when he saw the scuffed ground by the kitchen step. Mary came with a bundle of bread wrapped in a towel still warm from the stove. She set it down and peered at the captured man. Your mother couldn't love that anger, she said not unkindly. Caleb sent Noah to the Johansons for the morning, a trip marked by a new rule. Do not leave the road. Do not answer if a stranger speaks. Do not turn your head if you hear your name. Noah nodded like a soldier and went his small back straight as a fence picket. The sun lifted, and with it, the false mercy of daylight. Peregrine rode in at mid-morning starch in his collar and dust on his cuffs, a contradiction that seemed to define him. He dismounted, took in the hard eyes and the tied man, then inclined his head. I warned Mr. Dalton that appearances were cheaper than crimes, he said. He appears not to have listened. You came to see the wreckage or to distance yourself from it, Evelyn asked. Both, Peregrine admitted. My employer is angry, a dangerous kind of angry, but he is also vain. He will not risk a charge he cannot wash. Expect him to reach for others who will risk it for coin. Expect him to hide behind paper while they carry fire. Then tell him the paper did not save his men last night, Caleb said, and it will save less tomorrow. Peregrine looked at Caleb with something like respect. You speak like a man who has buried too many words and prefers deeds. Words kept a widow's land yesterday, Evelyn said. Deeds will keep her boy alive tomorrow. The banker's envoy nodded once, a small bow to a truth he could not ledger. He glanced at the captured man, then back to Evelyn. Turn him over to the sheriff, he advised, and keep your porch swept. Juries like porches that look swept. When Peregrine left, Caleb loaded the intruder into the buckboard with the same careful hands he used to set a saddle on a sore-backed horse. They took him into town, gave him to the law, and listened, while the sheriff promised to hold him until someone with more gold than sense posted bail. Evelyn left a statement that was plain and unadorned. Caleb said nothing because he had learned a long time ago that silence is a kind of blade the right ears can feel. By afternoon, the ranch seemed to breathe again. Clouds built to the west, white shoulders piled on blue. Noah returned with a pocket full of marbles a Johansen boy had pressed into his hand, as if luck could be traded in colored glass. He showed them to Caleb, who squatted and rolled one across the porch board, smiling when it made a perfect slow arc and came back to the boy's palm. That night a wind came up and rattled the cottonwoods without menace. Evelyn and Caleb ate in the kitchen with the door open to the cooler air. She set a jar of Mary's peaches between them, a summer sweetness that felt like a secret. After they walked the yard once more, not because they thought danger had gone, but because habit wears a path safe enough to trust. By the corral, Evelyn stopped. The world had turned the color of pewter, and the first star blinked on above the windmill. We won a day, she said, and tomorrow we'll buy another, Caleb replied. With what she asked, half weary, half defiant. With the same coin we use today, he said. Work. Watch. And the kind of love that refuses to lie down. She looked at him, then really looked at the man the storm had brought and the drought had kept. She reached and took his hand, fingers fitting as if they had learned each other long before they touched. Then I will not lie down, she said. From the ridge, a single rider watched the two figures in the yard become one shadow. He did not lift a rifle. He did not light a fuse. He only watched, and when he finally turned away, the shape of his shoulders said the next move would not be a test. Morning would bring it. And when it came, Red Mesa would hear a different kind of thunder. Dawn cracked open like a rifle shot. The sky over Red Mesa bled orange at the edges, sharp against the flat gray of a night not fully gone. Evelyn rose first, as she always did, her boots whispering across the floorboards. Caleb was already outside, rolling his shoulders, checking the cinch of his gelding. He looked like a man who hadn't slept, though his eyes were clear. The night watcher on the ridge had not returned, but the air carried a stillness that promised he hadn't gone far. The windmill creaked once, then held its blades pointed north, as if warning of something coming from that way. By mid-morning, word had reached them through Henrik's boy. Carver had broken out of the county jail. A deputy lay dead in Cedar Crossing, and the sheriff's posse had ridden hard, but lost the trail in the arroyos. Men whispered Carver would run for the border, but Evelyn knew better. The kind of hate he carried did not flee until it was spent. Noah listened with wide eyes as Caleb knelt beside him, steady hands resting on the boy's shoulders. You keep to your mama's side today. You do not wander. You do not answer if someone calls. You hear me, son? I hear, Noah whispered, clutching his toy horse so tight the wood creaked. The morning dragged, every sound stretched thin. A crow burst from the cottonwoods and Evelyn nearly fired at it. Caleb caught her wrist gently. Save your bullets for men, not omens, he said, though his own hand lingered close to his gun belt. It was noon when the riders appeared, not many, three shadows against the horizon, dust tails curling behind. Evelyn's stomach dropped. Dalton did not ride in such small numbers. This was Carver's way, tight and sharp, a knife instead of a hammer. They came fast. Caleb swung Noah into the root cellar, pressing the boy down with a promise. Stay. Whatever you hear, stay. He barred the trapdoor with a timber. Evelyn's breath shook once, but steadied as she lifted her rifle. Carver rode point, his grin flashing like bad silver. The two at his back looked meaner than they were brave, twitching too much, gripping reins too tight. Carver dismounted slow, letting his spurs ring against the packed earth. Widow, he called, voice smooth as snake oil. I hear you and your new man like to make stands. Thought I'd give you a stage. You picked the wrong play, Evelyn shot back, rifle leveled from the porch. Carver's eyes glinted. You think because a judge scribbled your name on paper, you're safe? I burned paper before. I'll burn more. Paper didn't stop you in Dodge City, Caleb said, stepping into view, revolver loose at his side. And it won't stop you here. But bullets will. The words shifted the air. Carver's grin faltered, replaced by a cold sneer. Still hiding behind women and judges, Ashby, come down and settle it clean. You came here dirty, Caleb said. You'll leave dirt. The standoff stretched, sweat crawling down spines, sun hammering down. Then the younger rider twitched, first gun clearing leather too quick. Evelyn fired before he steadied her shot, slamming into the dirt by his boot close enough to send him scrambling back with a curse. Caleb's revolver barked a split second later, sending the other man's hat spinning. Carver didn't flinch. He lunged sideways fast for a man carrying that much anger and fired. The shot tore splinters from the porch rail near Evelyn's hands. She dropped, rolled, and came up firing. Caleb moved with her two guns, answering one their rhythm like hammer and anvil. The second outlaw broke first, spurring his horse and bolting across the plain. The young one followed, clutching his hatless head. Carver laughed, but it was a sound without humor. Only rage. He fired again, grazing Caleb's shoulder, drawing a hiss. Last chance, Ashby, Carver shouted. Stand down and I'll let the widow keep her boy. Fight and I take them both. Caleb's reply was quiet, almost tender. You won't touch them. They fired at the same instant. Dust spat up between them. Carver staggered, his grin gone, blood blooming bright across his vest. He dropped to one knee, gun slipping. Still he tried to raise it, hatred dragging his hand higher. Evelyn's rifle cracked once more, clean and merciful. The gun fell from his grip. Carver toppled backward into the dirt, eyes open, but seeing nothing. Silence fell heavy, broken only by the creak of the windmill, turning again steady as though it had been waiting for this. Caleb lowered his revolver, breathing ragged. Evelyn stepped down from the porch, rifle still hot in her hands. She looked at the body a long moment, then at Caleb. It's over, she said, though her voice carried more question than certainty. Caleb wiped blood from his arm, wincing. With him, maybe, but Dalton's still breathing. They stood in the yard together, dust curling around their boots, the weight of what they'd survived pressing down. Evelyn bent, picked up Carver's fallen gun, and handed it to Caleb. Proof, she said. So no one in town can twist it into something else. He nodded. Proof, he agreed, but his pale eyes softened when they met hers. And warning, Dalton won't stop until he's forced to. Inside the cellar, Noah's muffled voice trembled. Mama, is it safe? Evelyn crouched by the trapdoor, fingers trembling as she lifted the bar. It's safe, sweet boy, she whispered. For now. But as she held him tight and Caleb stood watch, with smoke curling from his revolver, they all knew for now was a fragile thing. Word traveled faster than horses. By the time the sheriff came to take Carver's body, Cedar Crossing already hummed with versions of how he fell. Some said Caleb shot him in the back. Some said Evelyn had cried and begged. The sheriff ignored the talk, studied the scuffed ground, the angles, the burned fence rail where bullets had chewed. He took down statements in a careful hand, asked twice where Noah had been, then nodded once. Self-defense, he said. A bad man met a clean end. His eyes shifted to Caleb's bandaged shoulder. Keep that clean, he added. Infection is the enemy that doesn't ride a horse. Dalton did not come to see the body. He sent a wagon for it and a lawyer with the kind of jaw that never unclenched. The lawyer set his boots on Evelyn's soil and informed her there would be civil actions for damages to Mr. Dalton's reputation. Evelyn looked at the shallow pit where fire had scarred the yard and said the ground had already judged the matter. The lawyer's mouth pinched and he left as if the air offended him. 2 quiet days followed, so quiet the wind spoke like an old friend again. Caleb mended the gap in the corral, milled a new brace for the porch rail, and taught Noah to oil a saddle until it shone. Evelyn rode out at dawn to count the herd. 23 bodies moved through the dust like a slow-thought, ribs still showing, but eyes clearer. Hope returning the way grass does, blade by stubborn blade. On the third evening, Peregrine arrived with dust on his cuffs again and worry a little too obvious on his face. He tied his bay at the fence and did not take off his hat. That told Evelyn what his words would be before he spoke. "Dalton is done with half measures," he said. "He has hired men who care nothing for courts. They came north on the freight line last week. They have no neighbors to fear and no graves here to shame them." He did not say what else he knew, but his eyes did. They are paid to end something. Evelyn felt the world narrow, not like a trap, but like a tunnel a body must pass through to live. "How many?" she asked. "5 with rifles," Peregrine said, "and more in town who will keep doors shut and pretend not to hear." He lowered his voice. "I argued for patience. He called me a clerk and sent me to watch." He looked at Caleb. "You have until dawn." Henrik and Mary did not need to be called. They came with lanterns and bread and the kind of presence that fills a house with spine. The Johansson boys strung wire where Caleb pointed. Mary wrapped Evelyn's hands in thin strips of linen to keep blisters from opening and told her a joke about a bull too stupid to find an open gate. Noah carried bucket after bucket with solemn dignity, each one sloshing a little less as he learned the weight. When it was done, Caleb unrolled his pencil map again. He drew 5 X marks on the ground with a stick where a man would stand if he meant to shoot true from the cottonwoods, the ash pile, the old slag heap, the rail fence, the saddleback ridge. "No one stands where he thinks a fool would stand," he said. "So we welcome them where a smart man chooses." He shifted the X marks a few feet each, just enough to throw a sight line. Evelyn watched and felt the knot of fear in her chest loosen into something sharper. Not bravery yet, but a shape it could take. Night came quiet and clear, the kind of night that makes the stars look like nails hammered into heaven. Caleb took first watch, Evelyn, second, Henrik, third. Mary dozed upright in a chair with a shotgun across her knees, the image of a saint misremembered as a soldier. Noah slept under the table again without complaint, his toy horse under his chin. Sometime in that stone-colored hour between dark and dawn, when even coyotes think twice about making noise, the wind shifted. Caleb felt it before he heard a thing, the way a man feels a horse think about spooking. He touched Evelyn's arm where she sat and tipped his head toward the cottonwoods. 5 shapes slid out from the trees. Not hurried, not careless. Men who had worked in places where night and death shared the same hand. Each took a position close to Caleb's shifted marks. One tested the ground with a boot toe, trained enough to read dirt, too tired or too sure to read it closely. They settled. The earliest bird made a questioning chirp and got no answer. Caleb waited until their barrels lifted. Then he fired once at the ash pile, a shot that struck the dirt where the sight line would have been if he had been a fool. Instinct pulled the man there to step into the shot he expected, and Caleb's second bullet met him at the edge of that reflex. The man fell without cursing. The others fired in reply, fast and flat. Splinters leapt from the porch post where Evelyn's shoulder had just been. She rolled behind the rain barrel and planted around into the rail fence corner, aiming not at the flash, but the breath before it. Wood cracked, and a man grunted a single shortened word. Henrik's old rifle spoke once from the kitchen window. The sound was deep and decisive, the kind of sound that tells all listeners the person behind it knows what a rifle is for. 2 of the hired guns pushed hard, changing angles, good as wolves at their work. Caleb saw it and moved the way a river finds a new path after flood. He slid to the barn's shadow, counted their steps in his head, and shot where the second would put his knee as he dropped. A cry bit off at the end. The other man reached the slag heap and disappeared. Silence stretched. Evelyn held her fire, tasting the trick coming like iron on her tongue. A shadow detached from shadow behind the windmill. Clever, she thought, and shot the ground at his feet. He flinched, and that was all Caleb needed. His third bullet thudded, and the man folded sideways like a lamed calf. The last gunman understood what he had walked into. He did not run. He began to sing softly an old camp song about the Chisholm Trail and eased backward toward the Saddleback Ridge. Caleb listened to the rhythm and picked the half beats where a man lifts his heel. On the second lift, he fired. The singing cut off and the ridge kept its secrets. Smoke thinned in the faint light. A curl of dawn laid a line of silver on the windmill's blade. Mary stood and cracked her back, then moved to check the bodies quick and brisk. Henrik reloaded by feel eyes on the cottonwoods in case night had kept a surprise in its pocket. Noah slept on small breaths, even the storm outside kept where it belonged. When the quiet settled into something like morning, Peregrine came again, this time walking. He stopped at the yard's edge and looked at the men in the dirt, and the men still standing. His face was the face of a man adding a column he had not planned to total. He said nothing for a long while. Then he sighed. "He will come himself," he said softly. "Men like him believe in money until the moment they believe in their own hands more." He lifted his eyes to Evelyn. "Be ready for a man who has never had to do his own dirty work." Evelyn nodded. "I have scrubbed floors. Men like him would not put their boots on," she said. "I am ready." She was. But readiness does not still a heart when the horse appears. Late afternoon heat turned everything flat and dangerous. Dust plumed on the east road. A single rider. Clothes cut fine. No rifle across the saddle. George Dalton sat his horse like a man at a desk, back straight, chin, lifted the horizon already promised to him by birth and habit. He stopped at the gate and did not dismount. "Mrs. Hart," he said, "you have cost me dear." He gestured behind him with a mild hand as if indicating a mislaid ledger. "Men, time, money. I am tired of it." "You might try honesty," Evelyn said. "I hear it saves trouble." A small, almost genuine smile touched his mouth. "Honesty is a luxury," he said. Then he cocked his head. "Come sign a transfer in town. I will make you whole. You and your boy can live in a house with floors that do not splinter. Your animal can die without you watching." The calm in his voice was worse than a shout. It felt like the slick of oil on water. Caleb stepped to the porch edge, one hand on the post. Pale eyes never leaving Dalton's face. "And if she refuses?" he asked. Dalton's smile did not change. "I tear this place down to its well-stones and build my fence with the lumber," he said. He drew a small pistol from inside his coat. A lady's gun. A toy that could still kill. "Do not make me spoil my suit." The barrel lifted steady. Evelyn felt a strange stillness wrap her wrists, the same feeling that had come the first time she'd helped her father pull a breech berth into the world by lamplight. Calm allows hands to do what fear forbids. She raised her rifle, breathing once, ready to trade breath for truth. But a soft voice spoke first. "That will be enough, Mr. Dalton." Pastor Williams stepped from behind the cottonwood with the sheriff at his shoulder and 3 townsmen behind them, each with a rifle angled down but ready. Mary had sent a boy at dawn when she saw the hired men take their places because Mary believed in both prayer and posse. The sheriff lifted a hand. "You are under arrest for incitement and for hiring men who broke jailmen's bones. You can argue in front of a judge you don't own." For the first time, Dalton's face lost the shape he chose for it. Surprise opened a small door. Behind it, something mean and small showed its teeth. He flicked his pistol toward the sheriff. Caleb moved without thinking. 2 steps, a lift of his arm, a shove to Evelyn's barrel to keep it from firing into law. Dalton's shot cracked wild, sparking off the windmill's post. Caleb's shoulder took the blow of shoving instead of a bullet. The sheriff's rifle coughed once. The pistol fell from Dalton's hand like a dropped pen. The moment that followed was thin as paper and cut as deep. The sheriff crossed the yard, cuffs glinting. Dalton stared at them as if they were a bug he could step on. Then he held out his wrist with a courtly little bow that fooled no one. As they led him away, he looked back at the house, at the woman on the porch, and the man beside her, and his eyes carried a promise he could no longer afford to keep. Evening came soft after that. It did not feel like a victory parade. It felt like a fever breaking. Henrik took Noah to fetch water that tasted less of iron. Mary set a skillet on the stove that sang with bacon, like a hymn sung off key but heartfelt. Peregrine lingered and for once removed his hat. "I will be seeking other employment," he said. "There are men who build and men who take. I should like to try the first for a while." He looked at Caleb's bandage. "May I send a doctor at my own expense?" Evelyn smiled for the first time all day, a real thing small and bright. Send him, and send word that a woman who fought for her land can pay her debts without selling her name. Night folded down. The windmill ticked in a contented rhythm. Caleb sat on the porch step with Noah asleep against his side. Evelyn stood in the doorway and watched the shapes they made together. She went and sat, took Caleb's hand, and felt the grit ground into his palm, the proof of the day. We keep it, she said. We keep it, he echoed. Rain came toward dawn. Not a flood, not a thunder, just a steady patter that slicked the dust and sweetened the air. Evelyn lay awake and listened, counting the seconds it took for drops to run from eaves to barrel, a new kind of counting, a future kind. When Caleb stirred beside her, she whispered into the dim, not a vow, not a prayer, but a simple, stubborn truth. Tomorrow we mend, tomorrow we plant. And for the first time since the rope snapped and broke her life in two, she believed the soil would take what they gave and give back more than grief.